And I would like to introduce the next speaker, Miss Elise Mawson, an internationally certified child passenger safety technician instructor, qualified engineer, and the managing director of Far Eastern Travel Safety, a social impact-driven organization focused on improving the safety of children traveling in non-traditional modes of transport. The company co-creates sustainable, practical solutions with private enterprise, government departments, and a range of educational institutions to raise safety standards and affordability of travel solutions across Southeast Asia. Ms. Elise, please.
Thank you very much. I've spent the last 3 weeks working on everyone else's slides, and so apologies if this is not quite as polished. So Far Eastern has 2 divisions. We have Taxi Baby, which is our parent-facing area, while Far Eastern handles our corporate relationships. But both sides are focused on the one thing, which is keeping kids safely buckled, particularly in non-traditional modes of transport. We've worked with schools and bus operators across Singapore, Hong Kong, Thailand, and Vietnam to support them in developing, implementing, and maintaining robust, practical and sustainable policies to keep their children safely buckled on the way to school. Today, I'm going to do, effectively, Restraint Systems 101, and we're going to look at both those that are already on your school buses and those that you can add onto your school buses. So you know what to look for when you jump on the bus. Firstly, seatbelts. There are a number of different seatbelt systems available in vehicles used for school transport in Asia, but broadly, these can be categorised by the type of belt and by the type of retractor that they use. And bear with me, this is important for the next section. Okay, so you're all familiar with lap and shoulder belts versus lap-only seatbelts. Lap and shoulder belts are also called body restraining belts or 3-point seat belts, and lap-only belts are also called 2-point seat belts. As you can see from this video, this is a crash test of a 6-year-old in a lap-only seat belt. You can imagine that the difference that would make if they had a body restraining seatbelt. Okay, so lap-only belts are quite an old technology, and Vera's going to show some interesting crash tests later on that question whether they're actually helpful in school buses these days. Of course, the third type of seatbelt that you'll have on your school buses is no seatbelt at all. Now, if you have children under 12 years old, then you will probably need to use child restraints on your school buses. 3-point seatbelts offer the most flexibility to use booster seats, car seats, and harnesses, while lap-only seatbelts severely limit your options. There is a small range of US car seats that can be used either rear-facing or forward-facing with a lap-only seatbelt. And the Ride Safer vest, which you can see Vera has a booth at the back there, can also be used with a lap-only belt so long as you're using the tether, which can be used in a bus situation. If you don't have a full bus, you can attach it to the seatbelt behind, or if you have the option to, you can anchor it to the floor. Of course, many of your buses have no belt at all. The only child restraint I'm aware of that can work where there is no seatbelt at all is a new one out of Spain called Kiddie Harness, which you're welcome to come and have a look at the back. So the key message from this small section here that I'd like you to take home is there are a lot of different types of seatbelts, and not all of those seatbelts are suitable for children or for child restraints. Next, we'll have a quick look at retractors. This is the part of the belt that pulls the belt backwards into the vehicle. Okay, we have emergency locking retractor seatbelts, which in Asia, these are the ones that you're most familiar with. These ones will lock when you jerk them, or sometimes if they're connected in a passenger vehicle, when the driver puts the brake on. That doesn't usually happen in a school bus though. They're not normally geared up that way in a school bus. And one thing that you need to note on those ones is if you're using US car seats, So particularly for schools that have a BYO child restraint system, if parents are bringing child restraints and using it in your bus, especially for international schools, if those parents are used to a certain seatbelt system at home, chances are we have a different seatbelt system in the country that you're operating in, and their car seat may be incompatible with the seatbelts on your bus. So it's something to note. So if you're using US seatbelts, US car seats in a bus that has a 3-point seatbelt that only locks when you jerk it, you will need additional hardware to make that seatbelt work, because US seatbelts are actually quite different. The second type of retractor is a switchable retractor, and this is a US product. And the way this one works, and most of you may never have seen one of these before, is if you slowly pull the seatbelt all the way to the very end without jerking it, and then you slowly let it go back in, you will hear the retractor start to ratchet. And the retractor has now been switched into automatic locking mode, and it can only get tighter. And so this is specifically used, it's also called child restraint mode. This is specifically used to lock a car seat in place, and this is how most US seats work. Okay, now because we don't usually have these switchable seatbelts in Singapore or across Southeast Asia, where you have families coming from the US and they assume they can just use their US car seats, that's when you'll run into some trouble. The third type here is where there's no retractor at all, but you have a locking latch plate, and you might recognise those from the centre seat in the back of old sedans, where you have to manually tighten the seatbelt to remove the slack. In Singapore, the lap-only seatbelts that we have are typically locking latch plate, and we don't see them on school buses by and large. The lap belts that we see in Hong Kong, Thailand, and Vietnam tend to be emergency locking retractor seatbelts. And it's important to note that there are no car seats in the world that can be installed with emergency locking retractor lap-only seatbelts. So if you go back to your buses and you see that they have lap-only belts that can retract in and out like a yo-yo, if you pull that belt all the way to the end, slowly, and then release it back in, if you're able to pull a bit more slack out, you have emergency locking retractors, and that can be really difficult for transporting young children. Okay, so now that you've identified which seatbelts you've got on your vehicles, I'd strongly recommend that you inspect the working order of your seatbelts on a monthly basis, especially given that many vehicles across the region don't actually have their seats and their seatbelts fitted in the factory. They're retrofitted in-country for a number of reasons, one of which is usually tax breaks. And so when we've done audits across the region, in Hong Kong, Vietnam, and Singapore, some operations have more than half of their seatbelts compromised for one reason or another. So if you're going to all the effort of buckling up children, it's only half the battle if the seatbelts in your vehicles are not able to function as designed in an accident. Some examples of some unsafe seatbelt scenarios are where the seatbelt is fixed to the side of the vehicle, of the bus seat, but it's actually a seatbelt that's designed for a passenger vehicle. So when you get into a car, a normal car, you'll note the seatbelt comes from the inner wall of the vehicle body. But sometimes when these seats are retrofitted in country, those seatbelts are used, but instead of attaching the belt to the inner wall of the vehicle, the belt is attached to the headrest or the upper shoulder section of the vehicle seatbelt, of the vehicle seat, sorry. This may not be how that particular seatbelt is designed to function. Oftentimes it introduces a twist into the seatbelt. I have gone to car dealerships or school bus dealerships in Singapore and looked at brand new school buses, and they look beautiful. And then you sit down and you try and do up the seatbelt, and there's a 180-degree twist in the seatbelt, which compromises the restraint system significantly. And I say, why? Why? It's a brand new bus. Why is it done like this? And they say, well, the seatbelts aren't used very often, and if we were to install it safely, it would look messy when the bus is empty. Okay, so these are things to keep an eye out for. You also want to make sure that the seatbelts are not worn or frayed. That can impact how quickly the belt will retract into the retractor in an accident. Properly operating seatbelts are designed to retract by 10 to 15 centimetres in an accident and then lock. But if there's additional friction that's being introduced into the system because of frayed or damaged belts, that can slow down the retraction and it can reduce the effectiveness of the restraint. Obviously, if the buckle is not working, or you also need to be careful where the belt is being anchored. So I mentioned sometimes the belt is anchored at the top of the vehicle seat. You also need to look at the floor, where the seatbelt and the seat itself is being anchored. So has it been anchored to a fit-for-purpose reinforced section of the chassis? Or have holes been drilled willy-nilly and the seats have been installed anywhere? And if you were to ask them to change the position or the configuration of those seats, will they just pull those seats out, drill a whole new series of holes into the chassis and bolt those in instead? So these are things to consider. So if you've when we're looking at child restraint systems, we're looking at the end, at the downstream end of this process. But child restraint systems, like car seats and booster seats, they're only as safe as the seat belts that they're attached to. Those seat belts are only as safe as the anchorage points that they have. Are those anchorage points on the vehicle seat? Are they on the floor? Are they on the inner wall? If they're on the seat, how is the seat attached to the vehicle itself? You also want to make sure that the buckle stalk, so this is the small part of the seatbelt where the buckle is attached. Sometimes the attachment point to the vehicle seat can be very long, in which case it brings the buckle itself all the way up onto the stomach of a child. Or the buckle stalk itself has not been installed all the way over on the side of the seat. It's been installed sort of in the middle of the seat. So seatbelts are designed for adults and they're designed to work in very specific ways. So if the installation has been compromised, that will impact the effectiveness of those restraint systems. So now that we've looked at the existing restraint systems in your bus, we'll have a look at add-on restraints. We've had some excellent conversation today about LTA regulations. I want to talk a moment about a lesser known section of Singapore legislation regarding school bus safety. So this is the Road Traffic Act, Road Traffic Motor Vehicles Wearing of Seatbelts rules for 2011. You can see here that any person below 1.35 metres in height needs to use an approved child restraint or be seated on a booster seat or have an adjustable seatbelt which is approved by the registrar. These are Singapore legislations. So sorry for all the non-Singapore based people here. Bear with me. These are the adjustable seatbelt. We've seen some applications of that in Singapore and across the region. In Singapore specifically, the main point I want you to take home here is these adjustable seatbelts must be approved by the registrar. That's the LTA. And when I reached out to them, they said at that point in time, no adjustable seatbelts had been approved for use in school buses in Singapore. Like no one had come forward to request approval. They must also adjust both the torso section of the seatbelt and the lap belt section of the seatbelt. And Vera has some excellent crash tests that she can show you where it makes a really big difference. We aren't just looking at the shoulder belt part of the seatbelt. The lap belt part of the seatbelt can cause significant injury to children. So this rule does not apply. A lot of people understand this. This rule does not apply to taxis, okay? But you'll see down the bottom, it says it doesn't apply to any bus other than a small bus that is used for the conveyance of any child to or from school. And this is a part that's not well understood. So this means that the car seat law in Singapore applies to small school buses. And the LTA specifies small school buses as those with 15 or fewer passenger seats and those with an unladen weight of 3.5 tonne. So if you're operating an international school or a kindergarten, chances are high that a large part of your fleet are small school buses. This talks about what happens if you don't comply with those regulations. So a conductor or an attendant on that small bus shall ensure that every passenger on the bus is properly secured in accordance with Rule 8. And Rule 8 is that any person under 1.35 metres must have a child restraint. And if you don't, there is jail time and hefty fines applicable. So now that we understand that we have a legal obligation now to have children in child restraints, and I should say 1.35 metres is a lot older than you might expect. I hear a lot of people say, well, once the child is 4 or once the child is 7, they're probably able to use the seatbelt on its own. According to Singapore growth charts, most children aren't 12 before the time they reach 1.35 metres. So if you anchor it in your mind that all children until primary 6 need some kind of child restraint, that really changes how you view school transport safety. Now, vehicles used for school transport in Asia are often heavily utilised, and they transport adult passengers when they're not doing school runs. The vast majority of car seats and booster seats are designed for traditional usage. So this is where bulky or heavy seats are permanently fixed into a family vehicle, and that fixing might take Dad half an hour or longer. And that's just not practical for school bus applications. The mass transportation of children requires that child restraints are portable, quick to install, easy to buckle the children, affordable, safe, legal, and limited. And all of those probably make sense except for limited, but I'll explain that in more detail. So if we look at portability, especially if you're using the bus for other applications other than school runs, or if the bus is subcontracted and needs to do other operations, you need something that's easy to take in and out of the school bus. Back in the early 2000s, when the child restraint law was implemented in Singapore for small school buses, the LTA ran a financing sponsorship kind of program where they helped pay for the cost of implementing child restraints into school buses. Unfortunately, most of the products that were purchased were traditional child restraints, as opposed to fit-for-purpose child restraints that understand the operational limitations of school buses. And the result of that was that in practice now, not many small school buses have child restraints on board. So you can have a look at what we would call a non-traditional child restraint. You can have a look at some at the back. But these are products that are designed to be ultra-portable. The next one that you want to consider is something that's quick to install. So you want to avoid lag in loading times, especially if you've got some pickup points with multiple children, or you have some dubious pickup points where you can't really stay in that position for too long. Having a child restraint that takes a really long time to load can have severe operational limitations. Some products like this are easy enough for children to buckle themselves, and they take 15 seconds. And this includes the time that you would have normally taken to buckle up. We also want the child restraint to be easy to install. So if the bus attendants, drivers, teachers or parents are going to be fixing these child restraints twice a day, we want something that's going to be installed correctly every single time. If it's quick to install but it has a few little tricks to it, that's really not going to fit what's going to work for the school bus system. At the end of the day, the costs for implementing child restraints are going to flow through to the parent, whether it's directly through purchasing the child restraint or via raised school surcharges or bus fees. We've also got to keep our eye on the prize here, and we need the child restraints to be safe, right? That's the complete end goal here, legality aside. This month alone in Singapore, we've seen 2 bus accidents. So it's important to choose products that are independently certified by a reputable international jurisdiction. This was a couple weeks ago. So that was a rollover at Engneo on the PIE, and the driver was taken to hospital after the bus flipped. And this one was last Sunday. 20 people were taken to hospital, the youngest of whom was just 8 years old. So accidents happen in Singapore, accidents happen everywhere. And we can't control what happens. You'll notice, at least in the second one, it wasn't the bus directly that caused that accident. The lorry in front of it stopped. So there are so many uncontrollable factors in road transport. We need to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to keep children safe. On safety, we have an issue across the region with what we call fake car seats, mostly coming out of China. And these either bear no certifications at all, or they have fraudulent markings and fraudulent documentation. These ones here are copies of an existing child restraint called MyFold, which you can have a look at down there. I've taken these off school buses in Singapore. And the price is attractive. They're $12 each. And if you're buying hundreds of car seats, it's really hard to resist that. Or even if you're just buying one car seat, it's pretty hard to resist. The only version of this that's crash tested is the one with the brand name on it. Okay, I bought some, we had some in the office, and I was playing around with them. The real version of this, MyFold, is made with aircraft-grade aluminium. And this one that I'm looking at here, can you see it looks like metal there? That's a silver sticker. Okay, I pulled it apart with my hands. So these proper child restraints are designed to withstand severe crash forces in the event of an accident, and you want them to work. We're not going to all the effort of implementing programs, purchasing restraints, training bus attendants to use fake products. These ones here are also pretty popular. You can see they appear to have their own harness system, and the seatbelt goes in front. I've got a crash test of this one next. It's not made of car seat components, it's made of stroller components. So you'll see how that can behave in an accident. This one here is pretty popular as well. Vera's going to talk more about how booster seats work and why they do what they do. But what we want to do is we want to move the adult seatbelt onto the strongest parts of the child's body. That's the upper thigh bones and the collarbone. You'll see here, this localizes the seatbelt to the child's abdomen, okay, which has no protection. So severe internal injuries result when the seatbelt is in this position here. So I'm going to show you a crash test of this guy now. The child doesn't slow down at all. Okay, so there's no restraint provided by that system at all. We need child restraints to be legal. The LTA recognises restraints from certain jurisdictions. Okay, so an approved child restraint is one that's approved by the Deputy Commissioner of Police. If we have a look at the current Singapore legislation, that's the US standard, the now defunct British standard, the Australian standard, the European standard, and the Japanese standard. And I've got some examples. So like I mentioned before, we have instances in Singapore particularly where child restraints have fraudulent certification markings on them. Most of the time they have no markings at all, the fake products, but sometimes they have fraudulent markings and even fraudulent documentation. So this is what a European certified product looks like. It has an orange sticker with an E in a circle. An Australian product looks like this. You can see the red sticker with white ticks. And the US one is probably the hardest to identify. It doesn't have necessarily a really identifiable label, but it bears the words, "This restraint is certified for use in motor vehicles." Sometimes it will say "and aircraft," but... So last of all, I want to talk about having a limited selection on your child restraints. So it's really important to educate bus attendants, teachers and parents on how to correctly use these child restraints, both so that we have efficient loading times and also to make sure that we're using it safely. If you have a BYO car seat policy or a BYO child restraint policy in your school bus system, then you need to consider the burden of training and the burden of knowledge on the bus attendants. So if you decide to train each of them, or to train them to use those child restraints correctly, we estimate 3 minutes per bus attendant per quarter. That's how long in practice it's been taking us to train bus attendants. So if you consider the costs of training aunties for a single restraint, and then you say, well, we're going to open it up to any restraint, and there might be 10 different restraints on that bus, you need to multiply the cost of training by 10. Likewise, if you're just choosing 2 restraints, you need to double the training cost. Not only is it going to cost you more to train, but that auntie now has to remember how to install 10 different products or 2 different products, and that can introduce the risk of error or increase the risk of error. So we strongly recommend that schools nominate a single child restraint, and it takes quite a bit of work to identify which child restraint will be suitable for your application, but limiting the range of child restraints can have a really big impact on how practical and operable your child restraints program is. Thank you.